So good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this webinar on the future of North America trade hosted by Alexa Translation. My name is Dominique Babin, and I'm a partner at Dentons, where I practice business law with a focus on cross-border M&A, investment, and trade. The topic today is ambitious, the future of North American trade. But what is the current state of North American trade? Right now, North American trade is governed by the United States-Canada-Mexico Agreement, but I'll call it CUSMA, just to make it simpler. It links over 500 million people and nearly 30% of global GDP. But CUSMA is now up for mandatory review on July 1st of this year. A few words about this mandatory review. CUSMA entered into force in 2020, and is set to terminate in 2036. Its Article 34.7 provides for a mandatory review 6 years after it came into force, so this year. The review is not technically a full renegotiation. It is a formal mechanism built into the agreement that allows the parties to assess its performance and purpose and to decide whether they wish to extend its term for another 16 years. Each party can provide recommendations for the Commission to take action at least 1 month before the joint review meeting. These recommendations could result in formal amendments to the agreement. At the conclusion of the review, so on July 1st of this year, each country will have to confirm in writing whether it wishes to extend CUSMA until 2042. If all three parties agree, the agreement is extended, and the next review will be scheduled for 2032. If any party does not agree, CUSMA remains in force, but it will be subject to review every year until 2036. What can we expect from this mandatory review? Well, it's hard to say. That's why we're having this conversation today. As we all know, trade barriers seem to be making a comeback, mainly in the form of tariffs recently imposed by the US administration and also by other countries in response to these tariffs. But other forms of trade barriers also exist, or at least certain situations in Canada and other countries can be perceived as such by our trade partners. These include market access, regulation, labor and environmental standards, and even currency policies, just to name a few non-tariff barriers. Well, for good or for bad, the mandatory review is an opportunity to address all of these concerns. For optimistic people like me, this review is a chance to keep the dialogue open and to maintain a good long-term relationship adapted to current realities. Well, for business owners, however, it can be quite unsettling. Our panelists today will give their perspectives on the main elements of that review and what the outcomes could be. We hope that the discussion today will allow you to better understand the context and the key issues at stake, to plan concrete action to manage your business risks and your commercial relationships, and who knows, to identify opportunities. With that, it's my pleasure to turn the discussion over to Gary Doer, Gordon Giffin, and Gary Kalachi. And just by the way, during the presentation, you may enter questions in the chat box, and we'll do our best to answer them either during the presentation or at the end. Thank you and enjoy the presentation.
Dominique, thank you very much for that kind introduction, and to everyone that joined us today. Looking forward to this discussion. Gary, Gordon, and I did, along with Dominique, did a prep session, and there was already a lot of banter going between Gary and Gord, which I was excited to do in a more formal fashion here today. We only scratched the surface, so this will be an exciting opportunity. I will mention a couple of the housekeeping items because I see the number of participants sort of ticking up as people jump in. But essentially, if there's anything that you'd like to throw in the chat, feel free to throw it in. And if we can intertwine it, we will. And Gary and Gord, what I'll just for the purposes of today, I figured we can do just brief introductions so that obviously people have your background, generally speaking, as former ambassadors, but I think a little bit of your journey could be helpful for the people that don't know you as well in the audience. So, Gary, I'll start with you first.
Well, I was a former ambassador and proud to be that, representing Canada. One of the reasons I got to be an ambassador was Prime Minister Harper I knew many of the U.S. governors who ultimately became either members of Obama's cabinet or became, members of the U.S. Senate after leaving their governor's post. And so he was very interested in negotiating a new, more predictable border agreement, which he assigned me to work on. And he knew that Janet Napolitano had even been invited to watch polar bears in Churchill, Manitoba. So he knew I was shameless, and I remain that as we speak today. But I also got good advice from the former U.S. ambassador, Gordon Giffin, and he always provided me advice as I went along. And I would point out in discussing CUSMA, during the time I was there, Trump was getting ready to run for office. People think he's a developer, but he really is a marketer, people that know him from New York. And he labeled NAFTA the worst trade agreement in the history of the world. Not that there was any hyperbole to that. And then, of course, he also pointed out that TPP would be ripped up if he ever was elected president. And then he did both of those things. And then he came up with the CUSMA proposal, which after he agreed with Canada, Mexico, and the United States and got it agreed to in the Congress, he calls it the best trade agreement in the history of the world. So I often say to premiers, remind him that this is the best trade agreement in the history of the world. And that's on his bumper sticker from the first set of negotiations. But I would say, moving into these discussions, breaking news, Carney's much more popular in Washington than his predecessor, Prime Minister Trudeau. It's helpful, therefore, and he's got good people working for him. Janet Charette has just been added, who was the chief of staff for Jean Charest, and then Dominic LeBlanc is very, very capable, and he can relate. He's a politician. He's relatable when he goes to the Hill or meets with cabinet secretaries. He's a very good representative. It'll be interesting. I'm glad that Prime Minister Carney moved immediately to the 2% NATO target. We had agreed to it. We signed on to it. And then we told the Wall Street Journal that we had no intention of keeping it. And I think that if defense cooperation, security cooperation between Canada and the United States can lead to a lot of trade cooperation. They're not supposed to be related, but they are related when you're working as an ambassador. And I think it's going to be really interesting in the middle of CUSMA discussions. What do we do on the fighter jet issues being tendered? Recommend that Canada go with the F-35s that are interoperable with the NORAD in Colorado Springs. And right now, if there's a fighter jet coming across the Arctic from Russia, they scramble U.S. jets from Minot, North Dakota. I think it makes a lot more sense that we scramble them from Cold Lake, Alberta. And I think Carney's got a tough decision, but I would highly recommend that he go with the F-35s. So that's a long answer to a short question.
Yeah, thank you, Gary. And certainly, Gord had given me a heads up about your Churchill connections on the polar bears and the former premier days, premier of Manitoba days. I will take you up socially on one of those tours, but we'll leave that for another day. Gord, I'll pass it on to you for an introduction.
Thank you. Don't know that there's much for me to add. Dominique and Gary have done a very good job of covering the waterfront, so to speak. Great to be with you. Great to be with my friend Gary Doer, who was a remarkable representative of Canada in Washington, certainly on the very short list of the best ever. and did a great job and was there for quite some time. I mean, he was so good. He was there for about 6 years. And I will say I consider him to be a very good friend, not a professional compatriot, and I have enormous respect for him. He was a terrific premier. He got elected premier within, I don't know, 5 or 6 days of when I opened the then new U.S. Embassy in Ottawa, and he ended up coming to join us at that session, and I introduced him to President Clinton, which he enjoyed very much, and we've been good friends ever since. We disagree on some things like hockey teams and things of that nature, but we don't disagree on a lot. We're one of the things that is complicated in this subject is, from where I sit, it's USMCA, not CUSMA, but I understand why everybody north of the border calls it CUSMA. The deal that began this whole thing was the 1988 Canada-U.S. Free Trade Agreement, and we shouldn't forget that. It's been a migration over time to get to a destination of more efficient commercial relations between our two countries, and then including Mexico. But the emphasis I place on that is both an evolution. We were never at the destination, and we're still not. So the fact that we're in effect revisiting the rules makes a lot of sense. There are decisions that were made certainly in 92, 93 when we were finalizing NAFTA. I mean, it didn't even include the internet at the time. So if you lock it in stone and can't evolve, you're in the Stone Age. So it's important that it's not a bad idea to be evolving, as long as you're going forward, not backward. I will also say a couple of things to remember, because I have always been of the view, I was of this view when I was helping to implement NAFTA when I was ambassador. Everything doesn't have to be done in a trilateral context. And I think Canada, every now and then, feels like they got to bring a pal to the argument in order to try and counterweight the United States. And there just seemed to be a tendency to always want to invite Mexico to the conversation about what we do evolving through NAFTA. I will mention, as a matter of history, Canada didn't want Mexico to join the Canada-U.S. Free Trade Agreement. Canada was against that. That was an idea brought forward by then President Bush, and Canada didn't like the idea. They liked their partnership with the United States. Now Canada doesn't like the idea of maybe doing some separate deals with the United States. So I just say, a little consistency would be okay. But the bottom line of that point is, I think that Canada should take advantage of the assets that Canada has, the advantages that Canada has over Mexico in their relationship with the United States, which is a broader, deeper, more 21st century based relationship than Mexico has. Don't feel like it's a threat to negotiate some separate arrangements with the United States that doesn't include your pal. So that's a couple of quick points. A few other, I mentioned that this is a commercial relationship. Sometimes, and this is just my observation, Canadians dwell on the commercial relationship between Canada and the United States. They're always talking about the volume of trade that crosses bridges and, how much we sell to each other and all of that. The relationship is much deeper and much more important than our commercial relationship. And I think it undervalues the relationship to always talk about what we sell across the 49th parallel to each other. Gary talked about NORAD and our mutual defense relationship. That's a very important pillar in the relationship. Canada, for generations has been a geopolitical partner of the United States around the world. I know we've had some hiccups over recent years with the current U.S. administration, which has caused some dislocation. But historically, we have the same values. We have basically the same market system. We have, in many cases, the same heritage. And we have advanced those common interests together around the world for generations. We shouldn't lose sight of that as actually what I call the secret sauce, and not spend all the time talking about the balance sheet. So let's get back to being partners, not just trading partners. And I'll quit with the last observation, and Gary alluded to this, I think, earlier. There's an enormous amount of respect in Washington for Prime Minister Carney. He has a lot of equity as a result in the relationship with the United States because people take him very seriously. He's thoughtful, he's self-assured, he's very smart, he's worldly. Obviously, he knows the international financial systems, but he's also a businessman. So you start from the strength of people respecting the Canadian leader, and that's a very important point. As Gary said, Canada's got some talented people on point to work on this. Your new ambassador, Mark Wiseman, is a huge talent, and again comes from the private sector with a lot of financial background. And Janice Charette, who is the technical negotiator, is as good as they come. So you may have us outmanned in terms, or outpersoned in terms of the talent that's being devoted to this. So I said that was my last point. I will quit with this. And Dominique mentioned at the beginning, there are a heck of a lot of trade barriers that are not tariffs. Okay. Canada has mastered the art of non-tariff barriers. You call it cultural, which means if Netflix in the United States just wants to sell their products in Canada, they can't do it unless they load it up with Canadian content. That's a barrier. Most commercial interests want to just send what they got to the other country without having to change it substantially. And the so-called cultural requirements have always been a pretty significant barrier to commerce between Canada and the United States. Even labels, you require different labels on Campbell soup cans than we have in the United States, which slows things down. Currency value was alluded to earlier as a tool in the economic toolbox. Canada may not have a low dollar policy, but for some reason the dollar stays pretty low. So if it's not the policy, I'm not sure what's continuing to drive it. So tariffs on our side, on the U.S. side, I think have been used in an irrational and maybe illegal way. So I'm not for tariffs. But you have to be realistic when you're having these conversations. And the last thing I'll put in that bucket, and I'll shut up, is the digital services tax that Canada implemented. That was just a way to make it more difficult from digital service providers in the United States to sell their services in Canada. That's a non-tariff barrier. They called it a tax, not a tariff, but it's the same thing.
Thank you, Gordon. And that background in history is important because you can imagine, even for people in the audience, and this is being live streamed on LinkedIn as well. So one of the items that is important to understand is the history of how this came about to be. And to your point, initially was a deal between U.S. and Canada, and then sort of Mexico came along, and the consistency isn't always there as leadership changes. So that's an interesting point to be aware of. I will talk a little bit about the genesis of this. And by the way, to the audience, Gord doesn't have access to polar bears the way Gary Doer does, but he has been on Air Force One. So that's one. So if we're going to compare, what's more important, different people will have different priorities, but he has been on Air Force One.
I will say, Gary, when President Clinton would come to Canada, particularly one time when he came to Ottawa, I asked people whether they wanted to come to a reception to meet President Clinton or whether they wanted to tour with Air Force One. There was a pretty high demand for the tour as opposed to the meeting.
So we know that's a popular request. So for anyone that wants access to polar bears, Gary's your guy. Air Force One, Gord is your guy. So now we know. So just the genesis of how this webinar even came about to be, I was speaking to Gord last October, and I said, Gord, so what's happening with these tariffs? Are they about to subside anytime soon? And I'll tie this into the first question that I'm sort of going to pose to the two of you. And Gord said, "Well, look, Gary, there's been a sentiment for a while in DC. So while President Trump is the first that instituted them, that there's been a discount to the the Canadians by having a currency that is lower." May have had access to the American market at a discount as a result. So there's likely that some of this may stay long term, and that was an interesting point of view. I said I think we should dive into this more, and that's how this webinar came about to be. So, Gord, it was your idea and your suggestions. So on that note, the first question, and perhaps we'll start with Gary to answer this, and then we'll move on to Gord. But how should business leaders interpret the current trajectory of North American trade policy? Because this is, we've talked a little about the history, and both of you did a great job describing it. But where do we expect it to go? And seems like an unusual territory. At the same time, from the history that we heard, none of it was usual. It evolved a fair bit as it was. So I think but if you were to project what it could look like, Gary, what do you think?
Well, for the business community, I'm sure there was the Supreme decision on tariffs, in terms of the power of Congress and et cetera versus the president. I think for the business community, you're always trying to find a can-do solution to your disagreements. And I think for Canada, there are some issues the United States has always wanted in trade. Gordon mentioned the digital society. I remember we had to argue on culture and digital stuff in the TPP negotiations. We finally had to invoke Lorne Michaels controlling the culture of the United States with Saturday Night Live, but that didn't work.
Gary, I've lost you for one moment. I want to make sure because I'm not hearing you at the moment.
Actually, I was enjoying it. I couldn't hear him either.
It's because where he was going, Gord, that you were enjoying it. That's and I think you could read between the lines. Gary, sorry, I'll pass it back on to you. I wanted to pause for a second because I lost you for a moment. Gary, if you don't mind, I'll go to Gord and then come back to you because I still can't hear you. So I just want to make sure that it's until we pick you back up. So Gord, you saw where Gary was going, and I'll get a chance. He'll get a chance to rebuttal now after you get a chance to speak. So
yeah, well, I think part of what he was saying, and he has a good way of disarming me by going to things like Lorne Michaels controlling U.S. culture. I could respond by saying I think Katy Perry's now controlling Canadian culture, but we won't go there. I don't know. Somehow I got some interference there. I think the important point that Gary was, I think, beginning to make is that we have had a number of the issues. I mean, tariffs have become, the U.S. imposition of tariffs in an arbitrary way has become sort of the centerpiece of the public dialogue. I hope that it won't be the centerpiece of the private dialogue, because I think even many of the U.S. negotiators recognize that the manner in which the U.S. was arbitrarily setting tariff rates on items that aren't legitimately subject to tariffs can't be a long-term economic plan for the United States. So I hope that we can get past we're troubled by the fact that the U.S. has conducted itself this way, and deal with the future and deal with the issues. There are a number of issues that have been around for quite some time that are going to need to be resolved. We've mentioned many of them already, and I think both Canada and the United States need to come to the table recognizing that in order to have a deal, that requires people to compromise. And compromise these days seems to be a difficult word for people to use, but that's the way this works. And both sides are going to have to compromise. And it's not about, who's more moral or more ethical than the next guy. Let's not get too wrapped up in that. Let's get down to how we compromise. And it's not that hard to figure out, really. If you put Gary and me in a room for 45 minutes, we'd have it resolved. And so the focus needs to be on that there are legitimate issues to be resolved. And I will say, and I'm not trying to be argumentative about this, there is a perspective in Canada that everything Canada is doing is fine, and everything the United States is doing is unfair and should not continue. That isn't facilitating compromise, because it puts your negotiators in a position where if they do anything to change Canada's current practices, they've somehow given up, which is not true.
And it's a really good point, Gord. If where you're going is sort of the ultimate position to the negotiating table, it doesn't leave you much room to negotiate altogether. So that's a really
and by the way, I've been mad for several decades that Calgary and Winnipeg stole my two hockey teams from Atlanta, so I want them back. That's part of the deal.
And Gord is a Georgia man originally, so that's despite his current whereabouts, he's still Atlanta is close to his heart.
Yes.
Gary, now you get the benefit of having heard Gord's sort of backgrounder, so your rebuttal can now be better positioned. Gary, yeah, I'm still not hearing you, so I'll ask you for a favor to drop and join us back up if you don't mind. And what I will do is, while we do that, I'll just ask Gord for a couple of clarifications on what he was saying, because I think it'll be important. Your rebuttal will be important, and I know from our prep where you're going, so I want to make sure that that's there effectively. So, Gord, one question that came up in the Q&A, and thank you for the people that are participating in the Q&A, is sort of the deal that Prime Minister Carney did with the Chinese government on allowing a certain amount of electric vehicles to come into Canada. I believe the number was 49,000, which may not seem like a huge number, but it's about a third, I believe, of the Canadian electric market. What do you think this will negatively affect and potentially lose auto partners in the U.S. market eventually as this progresses?
I don't think so. I think it was a very, what I'll call, de minimis initiative that shouldn't be in the macro sense troublesome to the U.S., but it demonstrates that Canada has alternatives in the commercial marketplace. I think that's important for Canada's negotiating position, to show developments like that. I think it would be enormously important, frankly, for Canada to demonstrate in the short run, I mean, during the course of these negotiations, that they can commit to building a new pipeline to get oil and or gas, or both, preferably both, to the West Coast to demonstrate that Canada is expanding its markets for what today it is a much more strategic asset than it was 2 months ago. No matter what the President of the United States says, we do need Canadian oil, and we do need Canadian natural gas. Can we do without it? Maybe, I don't know. But we get those products euphemistically through the Straits of Mackinac, not through the Straits of Hormuz. So Canada has a real asset there, along with critical minerals. And positioned correctly, I hate to use the word leverage, but it's part of the negotiation. But Canada needs to demonstrate, and I think the deal that you mentioned on electric vehicles is a small part of demonstrating we have alternatives, folks. And if you don't figure out how to do business with us, we'll do business with somebody else. The one thing I will say, and hopefully Gary's back with us, there is a concern in the United States that Canada and Mexico are being used as backdoors by China and other economic players to get materials and products into the North American market that don't otherwise qualify. And what happens, for example, and I'm not trying to justify our steel tariffs in the United States. I don't agree with them, so make that clear. But there was a concern that Chinese steel was coming in at in effect, subsidized price into Canada. That the Chinese steel wasn't coming to the United States, but it made it possible to backfill in Canada with Chinese steel, and the Canadian steel could come to the United States. Well, the deal doesn't include China sending underpriced steel into the North American market that way. So it is a concern.
That's appreciate that background, Gordon. I think I know Gary was hearing us because I saw him making notes for the respective rebuttals.
He's going to have to learn sign language.
That's right. I do agree. It's a tricky issue, especially state-owned enterprises in Mexico. I think is a little more of an acute problem for the U.S. Back to on trade, I do believe we do have to find a bumper sticker for the president that is good for us, good for them, for the United States, and good for the president to say, you know, we got something out of this. And I would recommend it be critical minerals. We have 29 of the 31 critical minerals the United States needs. And somebody, a geologist told me we're the Costco of North America for critical minerals. Now, I think obviously we should keep a lot of them for ourselves for the new technologies, but also give an on-ramp to the United States. And I think that would be, I mean, there's other issues for the Americans that are quite legitimate, including dairy, which is a real issue in all the states. But critical minerals are something that we have, and it will help the U.S. economy and will help us. And I think that could be part of a North American trade agreement with Canada. But we obviously would keep a lot of them for ourselves, but not all of them, and give the United States an on-ramp. So that'd be my recommendation of a compromise.
And Gary, just for as a further follow-up to you, just because the Gord had a bit more time on this, I want to make sure Canadians don't feel left out, underrepresented in the process. In terms of how, and there's certainly been a sentiment in Canada to Gord's point where whatever the US is doing is wrong and what Canada is doing is right. But how do you think going into this negotiation and with what's happening currently politically from that framework, how should business sort of leaders in this context interpret our entry point into these negotiations and potentially start planning a little bit around it?
Well, I think part of planning is making sure you always show up in your businesses with your American customers and American governors to let them know how many jobs you're creating. Never underestimate the value of your company and the value of what you produce. That's a really important part of it, and you'll get a good audience. So I think that's really important. I think right now it's a little more unpredictable than I'd like. Last time, Lighthizer was the key trade negotiator for the president. Right now, Greer, one of the other people in the Trump administration, has been assigned to Mexico, and I think Lutnick is assigned to Canada, and that might provide a little more uncertainty than we had when Lighthizer was the president's representative, who was very aware of what was good for the United States, what was good for Canada, and where the deal was, and was also not only able to develop it or deliver it with the president, but also deliver it with Congress, which is equally important because these trade agreements have to be ratified. And I think right now we've got a little bit of a challenge on who's representing the president with us versus who's representing the president with Mexico, to be honest.
No, and really, really important perspective, Gary, especially sort of even to your point, reminding whether it's governors, et cetera, the jobs that are being opened. I think no one can argue with the impact when you can show impact on employment. Gord, one thing I want to come back to you with is, and you know, in terms of business planning, I'll come back to you both with a further question, but in terms of realistic prospects for change to the USMCA, so, you know, how different do you expect this to look? Do you expect that there will be substantial changes? Do you expect sort of, you know, relatively minor updates? If you, well, you know, maybe the way we should have done this is putting you and Gary in a room, come up with a draft of it, and said, "All right, problem solved. Let's make everyone's life a lot easier, less tension around it."
Yeah, no, we do concepts. We don't do details. We that's what staff was created for. I mean, it's hard to quantify. I think there will be and should be changes. As I say, the world's different than it was 6 years ago when the greatest trade agreement in history was finalized. And recognize, as Gary indicated, in the United States, you've now got a majority government in Canada. A majority government in the Westminster parliamentary system can act pretty efficiently. In the United States, efficiency is not one of the beauties of our governmental system, but the important point here is the Senate participates in this. Treaties have got to go to the Senate, and in this context, that's good, and it keeps things on a more balanced basis. I do think, Gary, that the Greer, the U.S. trade representative, will be pretty involved in the Canada negotiations. Again, Lutnick doesn't do details. I'm not sure what he does, but he doesn't do details. In the short run, Mexico is being more engaged with Greer. I don't think he's been assigned to Mexico. It's just they're putting a lot on his plate. They're putting a lot in front of him, and he's negotiating more with Mexico right now. And I don't know what Canada's strategy is there, so I don't pretend to have a view on that. But to the question, I do think there'll be changes. If there aren't changes, I think we're in trouble because the United States will need some changes in order to go forward. And I think, again, the tariffs need to get worked out and reconciled and put back on a legitimate, rational footing. But there are issues that Canada needs to come to the table and negotiate on. And if we find ways for all of that to work out, there'll be meaningful changes. It won't be wholesale, but it'll be the grounds upon which people can argue that it should be extended. You can't extend it as it now exists.
And Gord, just a quick follow-up, and then I'll pass it on to Gary because it's one of the questions that came in the Q&A. If and perhaps this will appeal more to the lawyer in you than strictly your political experience. But is there a substantive difference between a deal and an agreement? Because nations, like companies, enter into agreements rather than striking deals. And I think sort of the question may be referring to sort of the current administration in the U.S. referring to deals a bit more often and the art of the deal, etc. So, uh, not I thought worth posing this to you before I pass it on to Gary.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good point. I think Gary's got this very effective view of how you resolve disputes, and that's his euphemistic bumper sticker. So that would argue for a deal, I think, because there's one consumer in the United States, and he lives in a big white house in Washington, who likes that term. But we've got to have agreement as well. But I do think, and back to Gary Doer's point, part of the art of negotiating with the United States right now is to provide the context in which that White House bumper sticker can be used, and to do it in a way where you're comfortable with the fact that the bumper sticker will be used, and you just go back and you have some Crown Royal or Molson Canadian. You say, "Oh, we don't really care what they say. We know what we did."
Thank you, Gary. I thought your perspective would be important next.
Well, I do think with the president, Kuzma was the bumper sticker after he got rid of NAFTA, and he thought, he took credit for that, and which was popular. I think that the business community was a little bit checkered in terms of what it meant in some of the swing states. So that it's also important that we have good relationships with the swing states, which are all on the Canadian borders, except for Georgia, of course, and it's in Arizona. And so we've got to be very thoughtful of that. One of the big issues in the United States is dairy, and I don't know whether the by-elections in Quebec, with the Liberals winning that one seat, will help that. It's a tough issue. I know when we were dealing with TPP, we were trying to find ways of dealing with dairy quotas, and how do we deal with that and not undermine all the other things we were trying to negotiate in a new modern world of negotiations. But that has not been resolved. And I know when milk half as much price when I bought it, not that I bought it all the time as an ambassador, but I wanted to know what the milk was. And then it cost twice as much in Winnipeg. It's tough. It's always been a forbidden fruit in our negotiations, but I don't think it should be forever, because it's dated and it's costing us.
Yeah, and to Gary's point, I know it's got a pretty strong constituency in Quebec, but the United States has been complaining about, I'll call it dairy protectionism in Canada for decades, literally decades, and it's taken on more of a symbolic problem for the United States than its size warrants. It's not a huge economic issue, but it has a substantial. Northern New York State all the way across to Wisconsin are mad about it, and Canada always just says, no, we're never going to discuss dairy. So dairy will be something that will come up a lot. How Canada deals with that will be a challenge.
Well,
and it's interesting for Canadian consumers. It's also an issue, but definitely in the swing states, Wisconsin, there's not a Democrat or Republican candidate for president that doesn't go to Wisconsin and promise to get rid of it. And even Chuck Schumer promises to help the dairy industry in northern New York, or the yogurt industry, dare I say that. I didn't even know yogurt was in New York, but who am I? So it's still festering out there, and you know, you got to. It's a tough issue in Canada, but that's why you get elected prime minister.
Gary, you may have said this, but if I go to the grocery store in Ottawa, milk costs twice as much as it does in Atlanta.
Yeah, no, I mentioned that Washington. Yeah, exactly the same.
And so,
there
Gary,
is a consumer audience out there.
Yeah, they don't realize what's happening.
And Gary, just as a follow-up to you on this, do you think Canada this time around may be more predisposed to negotiate on this item versus sort of their historical position of we're not touching this?
Well, they could be looking at something like critical minerals that would be less politically problematic, and particularly in a small region in Ontario and a bigger region in southern Quebec. They could be looking at that. And I know we were looking at dairy a bit in TPP negotiations, because it also affected not just the United States, but we were dealing with New Zealand and Australia and Japan, and we were going to be thrown out of TPP and then not have North American trade. So I know we looked at it in that context, but I do believe there's a consumer argument for it too, as well in Canada. But we got to decide what we want to provide, and usually in negotiations, you choose something that doesn't hurt you and helps the other side, and that's the art of to quote Monty Hall from Winnipeg.
Gary, really appreciate that. Thank you. Gord, I'm going to come back to you on this. And it's one of the questions from the audience around, what would be the best routes forward for CUSMA, or whatever we end up calling it long term, formerly NAFTA, etc. The best agreement ever negotiated. Even if that ends up being the name, which we should all be open to it. But the reality is, politics, current politics society. If we were to plan an optimal best business path forward, how would you set it up? Because obviously, as the negotiations happen, it's about keeping in mind what the political issues are at the moment, but if you were to set this up for long-term success beyond making sure people get reelected, how would you approach it?
Well, I think a fundamental premise has got to be, and this, I hate to say this because it was never a concern in the past, Canada's got to be able to trust the United States. You've got to be able to trust that we will stick with a deal that we make, that 3 months later, we won't do something arbitrary and ad hoc. So for Canadian negotiators to take some tough steps, to compromise, to do the things that are necessary to bring forward an evolutionary agreement, they've got to be able to go back to Canada and say, we have a deal and we can rely on it. That's going to be, in my judgment, the toughest thing for the Prime Minister, for the negotiators from Canada to do. I think they can figure out how to thread the needle on some of these issues because it's important that we do it. So that's premise number one. Premise number two is, I don't understand why together, and Canada could start this if they believed in it, we don't make the case collectively that we can be a much stronger economic force in the globe together than we are separately. The assets, some are natural assets, meaning minerals in Canada, oil and gas in Canada, other things. Some are intellectual capital assets. Some is just capital assets. There's a hell of a lot more capital in the United States than there is in Canada. And to develop the sorts of things that Canada wants to develop, all across the country, it's going to require private capital. The government of Canada can't subsidize all this stuff. So to create an atmosphere in which there's more access to capital, we should be creating an environment where we're taking on the role of an economic bloc that is significant in the global contest. And why we don't talk about that more, I don't know, because oftentimes you've got to have somebody that you're winning against, right? In order to get emotional support for what you're doing. So change the dynamic. Don't make it that we're trying to win against each other. We're trying to win against the world together.
Yeah, a really good point, Gord. Gary, your views on that, and I know some people in Canada would say, well, that's how we may have looked at it, but it feels differently today. Sorry, Gary, I'll pass it to you.
No, I said I'll second Gordon's motion.
Well, and it's that's certainly how what it would make a lot of sense. Gary, any further thoughts on this just before, because I have a couple items that had come from the audience that I do want to ask in the last few remaining minutes of the presentation. But I just thought in case you had something else on this front.
No, questions are good.
Perfect. So the next question was, Canada is notoriously a protectionist country, although citizens seem to somewhat obliviously miss this. So telecoms, dairy, airlines, and banking, but few examples. Had this led to an increasing frustration on the part of the Trump administration as there's a desire to play hardball? And Gord, maybe I'll come to you with this first.
I don't think so. I don't think so. We all have our segments of the economy that we protect. American agriculture has been protected in various ways forever, for example. And so I don't think there's anything unique about what Canada does in that respect. I do think that the average citizen in Canada doesn't realize that that's what's going on, because many of my friends in Canada talk about how protectionist we are, and the U.S. is, and I acknowledge that we've got our segments of our economy that we do, quote, protect. But sometimes I get a little flippant and said, do you own a mirror? Look in it. So, I mean, there's nothing unique about what Canada does. It's just that, all of the bad actions, all of the actions that are somewhat market distorting aren't south of the border.
Very, very good points. Appreciate that. And then Gary, I'll come to you with the next question, and you can feel free to add to this as well.
Okay.
Canada has many energy limitations due to green energy policies, and is an indication of its ability. So, is the fact that Canada has many energy limitations due to green energy policies an indication of its ability to negotiate with the U.S.?
Well, no, it is. The U.S. If you look at California, you look at Texas, you look at all the solar that's now being introduced in some parts of the United States. They don't campaign on it. They kind of talk about Texas. They're back up with a lot of renewable energy, a lot more than people even know about. And then back to United, Delta, the American airline, which is being taken over by United, most of them fly up to Canada and back to the United States. I think the banking is something President Ray's White House scrum. He's got lots of friends in New York. Um, I, I would be, I wouldn't be complacent on that issue as a Canadian leader in terms of our economy. And then, the president talked in the White House about the Canadian banking industry. Somebody in the Canadian banking government relations, I think Trump reads newspapers, so Wall Street Journal, the New York Post, and they got into a great defense of Canadian banks. So whoever the GR person is, if they're on the line from a Canadian bank right now, you did a good job getting that. You didn't bury your lead with the U.S. president. But banking, I wouldn't be. I wouldn't financial services and banking. I wouldn't be complacent.
Thank you, Gary. Gord, I know we're sort of in the last few minutes, so any parting thoughts on this more generally, like on the topic more broadly, where you're like, there were a couple items I wanted to mention, and Gary Kalata didn't get a chance to ask me.
Well, I guess what I'd say is we spend a lot of time in conversations like this identifying where the problems are and identifying, what we disagree about as between Canada and the United States. I want to go back to a fundamental premise that I believe in. We've figured out how to coexist and partner for generations, and I think we will. I think we will continue to do so. We're having rocky times right now, without a doubt. I will say, I would ask my friends in Canada, put the 51st state rhetoric behind you, because that was offensive. I get it. It was. I won't try and use any more adjectives, but it should never have happened. And I think it was fairly something that aggravated and angered many Canadians. But it's going nowhere. It's just rhetoric, and it has in a way created an undercurrent in Canada that makes it a little bit more difficult to do a deal, because people are still mad about that. That is noise in the background, and we need to get past that so we can get on to how we work together. Every now and then I say something that I shouldn't say to my friend Gary Doer, and he doesn't spend the next year and a half mad at me about it. He just realized that I said something stupid. So we move on. Easy for me to say, but I think that is still affecting the manner in which we work with each other. And I just hope that can be put behind us, because it wasn't rational, it wasn't fair, but it's gone.
Gary Doer, any 60 seconds, any last thoughts before I wrap it all up for us?
Well, I agree with Gordon on that issue. I disagree with him on hockey, although he enjoyed he enjoyed some of those hockey games more than I did. I enjoyed some of the ones last year a lot more than he did. So it was. It was great competition, and both men's and women's hockey, and we got to lace them up in the next Olympics for sure.
Thank you to all three of you for joining me here today. Dominic, thank you.
Patel in our locker room, so I just want to say that.
Thank you, Gary. And at the next webinar, we'll talk about your stories with Guy Lafleur. But I just wanted to again thank everybody for being here today.
Thanks, Gordon.
Dominique, Gary, Gordon, it's been a great discussion. Really appreciate having you here. And no, it's fine. And in fact, the question came up in the webinar is recorded, and you'll be able to have access to the recording. Many people, as you can appreciate, a lot of executives cannot join live, so that's why we provide it as a recording as well. Thank you all for joining us here today. It's been fantastic having you on the webinar.
Thank you.
Great to see you.